Most Americans today can't imagine a country without an income tax. Not because they're blind, but because they've been conditioned. Conditioned to believe taxes are the price of civilization. Conditioned to believe Washington can't function without siphoning nearly half of your income. Conditioned to believe that the IRS is as old as the Constitution itself. But here's the truth no one teaches in school. For most of American history, there was no federal income tax at all. No IRS, no April 15th, no withholding, no tracking every single dollar you earn. And not only did the country function, it exploded into the fastest growing economy the world had ever seen. Let's trace it. America's first 137 years. No income tax, maximum freedom. When the Constitution was signed in 1787, the founders debated plenty of ideas. A federal income tax wasn't one of them. Why? Because these men had just fought a war against a government that bled its citizens dry. They knew exactly what happens when the state sees the individual as a resource to harvest. So instead of taxing income, the early US government funded itself with tariffs on imported goods, excise taxes, whiskey, carriages, sugar, public land sales, small corporate taxes. That was it. No one was mailing the government a third of their paycheck. No one was paying capital gains, payroll tax, estate tax, or income brackets. And here's the part that should shock every modern American. From 1887 to 1913, the era with no income tax, the United States went from a fledgling republic to an industrial giant. This was the age of railroads, steel, manufacturing, electrification, the telegraph and telephone, mass immigration, booming entrepreneurship. The US went from a coastal experiment to a continental superpower, and it did it without taxing individual income. You want to talk about proof of concept? There it is. The Civil War, the first crack in the door. Let's take a look at this. The first time America experimented with income tax wasn't philosophical, it was existential. In 1861, the Union needed money to fund the Civil War. So Congress passed a temporary income tax. Temporary. 3% on incomes over $800. People tolerated it because they understood the stakes. And when the war ended, the tax disappeared. Gone, as it should have been. But something dangerous happened during that brief window. The government realized how powerful income taxation could be, not just as revenue, but as leverage, as reach, as an instrument to control and shape economic behavior. Washington had tasted the fruit, and once a government tastes it, it never wants to let it go. The real break came in 1913. The 16th Amendment legalized a permanent federal income tax. The people were promised it would be tiny, limited, targeted, only for the rich. In fact, the very first tax bracket was 1% on incomes above $3,000, 7% on incomes above $500,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent to taxing only millionaires. Politicians swore ordinary Americans would never be taxed. They swore it would remain modest. They swore it would stay under control. But power never stays under control, not when it comes to taxation, not when it comes to Washington. Within just a few years, World War I hit. Rates skyrocketed, brackets multiplied, the government exploded in size. The argument was always the same. Just a little more, just for now, just until we get through this crisis. But crisis in Washington is like oxygen. It never runs out. And every time the government expands to meet a crisis, it never shrinks back to its original size. Fast forward to the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt created the modern foundation of the federal bureaucracy. Programs, agencies, departments, federal authority reaching into every corner of life. To fund it, income tax rates climbed again and again until at one point the top marginal rate hit 94%. When people today ask why the wealthy hid money, moved assets, and invented entire categories of deductions, there's your answer. When a government taxes success at 94%, it's not governance, it's confiscation. And here's the uncomfortable truth economists quietly accept. Much of America's mid-century growth didn't come from taxes. It came despite taxes. The IRS becomes a machine. By the mid-20th century, Washington had perfected the model. Tax everything you can. Borrow everything you can't tax. Print money when borrowing becomes politically inconvenient. That's the modern system. Not an accident, an evolution. A slow creep from a limited government toward an a slow creep from a limited government toward an extraction engine operating off of your labor. And because the income tax became the backbone of federal power, Washington learned a crucial lesson. The more complicated the tax code becomes, the easier it is to manipulate the population. Hidden taxes, hidden control, confusing systems, unquestioned power. This isn't conspiracy, this is structure. Could America function without income tax today? Well, it already did, for over a century, and it grew faster during that century than any other nation in history. That is the part Washington hopes you forget. The US government today doesn't have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem, an accountability problem, a fraud problem, a bureaucracy problem. America takes in over $4.4 trillion per year in taxes, more than at any point in human history. And yet Washington is still broke, still in debt, still asking for more, or demanding it. That doesn't mean citizens aren't paying enough. It means the government is consuming too much. A nation can recover from a shortage of revenue, but it cannot survive a shortage of restraint. If this is helping you understand how America actually operated before the income tax, do a couple things for me. Like, subscribe, and comment, regardless of what platform you're on. It pushes this material out, so the algorithm on whatever platform says that this is important stuff and the American people deserve to know. In the next section, we're going to talk about the spending machine, how Washington burns trillions of dollars and calls it necessity. So here's the part no one wants to say out loud. America doesn't have a taxation problem. It has a spending addiction. A compulsive, systemic, bipartisan addiction. Washington isn't drowning because citizens don't pay enough. Washington is drowning because Washington refuses to stop lighting your money on fire. And once you see how deep this goes, you never look at the tax debate the same way again. The US government takes in more money than any government in human history. Let's start with the numbers, real numbers, not talking points. In 2023-2024, the federal government collected roughly $4.4 trillion in total tax revenue, $2.2 trillion from income taxes alone, $1.5 trillion from payroll taxes, Social Security, and Medicare, hundreds of billions of dollars from corporate taxes, excise taxes, and other sources. This isn't a starving government. It isn't a struggling government. It isn't a government desperate for resources. It is the wealthiest government that has ever existed on Earth. And yet somehow is still over $34 trillion in debt. Let that sink in. A government that collects trillions per year still spends so recklessly that it is permanently in the red. This is not taxation. This is mismanagement. This is not necessity. This is gluttony. Where does the money actually go? Most people don't realize this, but nearly 75% of all federal spending is on autopilot. Autopilot means Congress doesn't vote on it, doesn't debate it, doesn't adjust it. It just happens. Those categories are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt. That last one, interest, is the silent killer. In 2024, the US paid over $1 trillion in interest payments alone. Not on roads, not on defense, certainly not on veterans, and definitely not on infrastructure. Just interest. That number is bigger than most federal agencies combined, and it exists only because Washington cannot stop spending money it does not have. This is what every politician refuses to admit. The US government could cut taxes and still function, but it cannot survive if it keeps spending at this level. Fraud, waste, and abuse, we've seen it, and we see it currently. The federal government loses hundreds of billions of dollars per year to fraud and improper payments. That's not speculation. That's from official government audit reports. So, you want an example? Medicare, $50 to $80 billion per year in improper payments. Medicaid, $80 to $100 billion. Unemployment systems during COVID, $200 to $400 billion stolen. Pentagon fails every audit for 6 straight years. The IRS admits the tax code is so bloated it loses hundreds of billions of dollars in errors annually. This isn't a crack in the foundation. This is mold. Thick, growing, structural mold. And the response from Washington? Every time the system fails, the solution is always the same. We need more money. No agency ever says we need accountability. We need discipline. We need to clean house. We need consequences. No, the answer is always raise taxes, expand the IRS, increase the budget. This is the same logic as a gambler who believes the next bet will fix the last one. The government spends like it has no consequences. If you ran your household like Washington runs the federal budget, you would be arrested. Imagine, you make $80,000 per year. You spend $120,000 per year. Then you borrow $40,000 every year just to stay afloat. And when the credit card bill comes, instead of cutting spending, you demand your employer gives you more money for stability. That's Washington, except scale that to trillions of dollars. The truth is simple. America is not overtaxed. Washington is overspent. Every dollar wasted is a dollar taxed. Every dollar borrowed is a future tax. Every dollar printed is an inflation tax. People don't understand this last one. Inflation is simply taxation without legislation. When the government prints money to avoid accountability, the value of every dollar you own shrinks. That's a tax. It's a silent one, a permanent one. And the same politicians who claim they're protecting the middle class are the ones driving the inflation that hits the middle class the hardest. Could America function with dramatically lower taxes? Let's get analytical just for a moment. Could the United States actually run without an income tax entirely? Well, mathematically, yes, if spending discipline actually exists. Remember, America thrived for 137 years with no income tax. Even today, if the federal government eliminated waste, reformed entitlement inefficiencies, stopped borrowing trillions unnecessarily, cut non-essential bureaucratic bloat, enforced existing program oversight, then income tax at the current level would be unnecessary. But Washington operates on the opposite philosophy. Why cut spending when you can raise taxes? This is why every conversation about taxes feels dishonest, because politicians refuse to admit that their addiction is the problem, not your productivity. The tax burden is not just one tax, it's all of them. When you talk about 40% taxation, you're not wrong. The burden includes income tax, payroll tax, sales tax, gas tax, property tax, corporate tax, passed down to the consumers, of course, inflation tax, fees, licensing, and regulatory costs that function as hidden taxes. Americans today often pay 30 to 45% of their income into systems that waste, lose, or misallocate money at historic levels. Is it any wonder why people feel like they're running on a treadmill with a government hand on their shoulder? We're not undertaxed. We're overexploited. The deeper truth is this. Government sees citizens not as partners, but as revenue streams. The more money Washington wastes, the more money Washington demands, and the more it punishes productivity to sustain its own dysfunction. This is not sustainable. This is not moral. This is not what the founders built. And this is why millions of Americans feel something is fundamentally broken, because it is. If this last section helped you see how Washington burns trillions of dollars and still asks for more, do one thing before you keep listening. Like, subscribe, and comment again. It pushes this out and tells these platforms that this is important. The American people need to know this. In the next section, we're going to cover the invisible tax, inflation, debt, and the quiet erosion of American freedom. There's a tax in America most people never see. It's not printed on your receipt. It's not taken out of your paycheck. You don't vote on it, consent to it, or even get warned about it. But it hits harder than income tax, property tax, or sales tax combined. It's called inflation, and it is the most predatory tax the US government has ever created. Not because Congress debated it, not because the IRS enforces it, but because inflation works in the shadows. It steals from everyone, quietly, universally, relentlessly. And worst of all, it's a tax created because Washington refuses to stop spending money it doesn't have. Let's be blunt. When Washington overspends, the Federal Reserve steps in to cover the gap. How? Not by earning money, not by producing value, but by printing money into existence, digitally, instantly, endlessly. Since 2008, the US money supply has exploded from 800 billion in circulation to over 20 trillion today. That's not growth, that's dilution. Imagine you owned 1% of a company and the company prints more shares without increasing its real value. Your 1% becomes 0.5%, then 0.3, then 0.1. You didn't lose your shares lost their worth. That is inflation. It is not random, it is not natural, and it is certainly not accidental. It is engineered. Engineered to keep the spending machine alive. Engineered to hide the true cost of government. Engineered to avoid accountability. Here's the harsh truth. Inflation is a tax that hits the poor and middle class 10 times harder than the wealthy. Because wealthy Americans own assets. Assets rise with inflation. Everyone else owns cash, and cash burns. Look at the data. Since 2020, the dollar has lost over 20% of its purchasing power. Food prices are up 25 to 30%. Rent is up 20 to 40% depending on region. Energy costs remain elevated even after cooling. Household savings have collapsed to their lowest point in over a decade. Credit card debt passed 1.3 trillion for the first time in US history. And yet Washington keeps insisting. Inflation is cooling. Things are stable. The economy is strong. No, the government is strong. The people are struggling. Inflation is not a symptom of global events. It's the direct result of federal policy. Massive federal deficits, trillions printed during the pandemic, wasteful spending bills, zero restraint in Washington, endless borrowing with no repayment plan. The government pretends inflation just happens. No. Inflation happens when your leaders use your future to pay for their present. You've seen the debt clock, 34 trillion, growing every second. But here's what almost no one tells the public. The US is now adding $1 trillion in debt every 100 days. That is not sustainable. That's collapse speed. Interest on the national debt has become the third largest federal expense, surpassing veterans benefits, education, transportation, most federal agencies combined. In 2024, the US spent over $1 trillion just servicing interest, and that number is expected to hit $1.5 trillion within a few years. This is the moment every serious economist fears. When interest becomes bigger than investment, when past mistakes consume the future, when the government pays for yesterday instead of building tomorrow, this is how empires fall. Not through invasion, but through insolvency. The US government doesn't solve problems. It subsidizes them. It funds them. It expands them. It institutionalizes them. Think about it. Welfare expands, poverty stays. Housing subsidies expand, housing prices rise. Student loans expand, tuitions skyrocket. Health spending expands, healthcare gets more expensive. Defense budgets explode, accountability shrinks. Federal bureaucracies grow, efficiency dies. This isn't coincidence, this is incentive structure. Government benefits when problems persist because solutions end budgets, but problems guarantee them. Federal agencies don't want efficiency. Efficiency gets them downsized. They want crisis. Crisis gets them funded. So let's address the root question. Could America function with dramatically lower taxes? Absolutely. But Washington would need to do one thing it refuses to do. Stop spending money like it's limitless. Here's the truth. If the US government eliminated waste and fraud, cut bureaucratic bloat, reformed entitlement inefficiencies, stopped sending billions of dollars overseas with no accountability, stopped printing trillions that create inflation, stopped borrowing money our grandchildren cannot repay, the tax burden on the average American could drop dramatically. But politicians won't do that. Not Democrats, not Republicans, because both parties run on the same fuel. Money they did not earn. Money you are forced to provide. Money printed when taxes are not enough. The government doesn't have a revenue problem. It has a discipline problem. So the hidden truth, taxes aren't about funding. They're about control. When you dig deeper, you find the uncomfortable truth. Taxes are not primarily about funding government. They're about shaping behavior, controlling outcomes, and maintaining power. Look at the tax code. It's not a revenue system. It's a social engineering manual. Tax credits to reward certain lifestyles. Penalties to punish others. Regulations that pick winners and losers. Loopholes written by lobbyists. Complexity that guarantees dependence. The founders warned that a government powerful enough to tax everything you earn will eventually regulate everything you do. We are living in that world right now. The question isn't whether taxes are too high. The question is whether a government this broken deserves them. That's the core argument. Not cut taxes because people want more money. Cut taxes because Washington has not earned the right to take more. A government this wasteful, a government this incompetent, a government this unaccountable, a government this bloated should not be trusted with a larger share of your paycheck, or any more of your future, or any more of your freedom. If this breakdown is opening your eyes to the deeper rot in our financial system, do one thing to help push this message past the algorithm. Like it, subscribe, and then comment. What America would look like without punitive taxes, endless debt, and a government that treats citizens like ATMs. By now you've seen the pattern. Taxes didn't rise because America needed more money. Taxes rose because Washington refused to control itself. Inflation wasn't an accident, it was engineered. Debt wasn't mismanagement, it was a strategy. So let's ask the question almost nobody in mainstream politics has the courage to ask. What would the United States look like if taxes weren't designed to prop up government excess, but to serve the citizens again? What if America actually lived within its means? What if Washington had to budget the way every family and every small business in this country has to? What if fiscal responsibility wasn't a campaign slogan, but a requirement? This isn't fantasy, it's simple math. It's history, it's structural truth. And it starts with this. Number one, America could run on far less tax revenues if spending wasn't insane. Let's anchor this in real numbers to avoid political spin. Federal revenue today, approximately $4.8 trillion collected annually. 50% from individual income taxes, 35% from payroll taxes, 6% from corporate taxes, the rest from excise taxes, estate taxes, tariffs, etc. Federal spending today, $6.2 trillion annually, meaning the US spends $1.4 trillion more than it earns every single year. Now here's the part that should outrage every single one of you. According to multiple GAO and Inspector General reports, the federal government loses between $300 billion and $500 billion every year to waste, fraud, and improper payments alone. Add to that massive bureaucratic redundancy, agencies with overlapping missions, programs that haven't been audited in decades, foreign aid with zero accountability, Pentagon spending that can't pass a single audit, billions of dollars in grants with no measurable outcomes, interest payments spiraling out of control. Then ask yourself, why should the government take more from citizens when it cannot manage what it already has? The truth is simple. America doesn't have a tax shortage. America has a discipline shortage. And Washington's lack of discipline has become your burden. Number 2, countries with lower taxes often deliver better quality of life. Here's a data point that demolishes the idea that high taxes are necessary. Many nations with lower overall tax burdens outperform the US in infrastructure quality, public safety, cost of living, education outcomes, social stability, economic freedom. Examples: Switzerland, lower income taxes than the US, far less bureaucracy, 5 times the fiscal discipline. Singapore, no capital gains tax, no estate tax, 0 to 22% income tax brackets, world-class service. The UAE, virtually no income tax, massive infrastructure investment. Ireland, corporate tax incentives led to one of the strongest tech economies in the world. These nations tax less because they spend wisely. The US taxes more because it spends recklessly. Number 3, what a low-tax America could actually look like. This is where monologue becomes vision, a blueprint, a reminder of what is possible. If America ran on fiscal discipline, you'd keep more of every single paycheck, not 60% after taxes, fees, inflation, penalties, and hidden costs, but truly keep what you earn. The government would shrink and get more efficient because agencies would have to justify their existence instead of assuming it. Inflation would drop dramatically because the money supply wouldn't be used as a bailout for overspending. Housing would become affordable again because interest rates would stabilize instead of fighting inflation caused by government actions. Small businesses would explode with growth because low taxes plus predictable regulations equal innovation. Federal power would return to states and citizens because Washington wouldn't have the money to micromanage every aspect of American life. America would become the most attractive investment hub on earth because capital always flows to discipline, stability, and freedom. This isn't radical. This used to be normal. For most of US history, the federal government did not consume 30 to 40% of the nation's output. It was lean, it was limited. It spent what it had to, not what it borrowed. We've drifted so far from the founding blueprint that slavery to taxes feels normal. It is not. Number 4, the founders warned us exactly about this. Jefferson said, "It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts." Washington said, "No nation can maintain its freedom if its leaders indulge themselves in the accumulation of debt." Franklin said, "When the people find they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic." The founders understood something modern America tries to ignore. Freedom dies when government becomes financially obese. Because an oversized government requires oversized taxation. And oversized taxation requires oversized control. That is where we are today. This isn't a policy dispute. It's trajectory. And trajectories have consequences. Number 5, could America function with a 10 to 15% flat tax model? Economists across the political spectrum, left, right, libertarian, have run models on this. And the answer is yes. If federal bureaucratic waste was reduced, agencies were consolidated, unnecessary overseas spending was cut, fraud was aggressively prosecuted, entitlements were modernized, the government stopped printing trillions. Then the US could operate with a simple, low, flat tax. No IRS complexity, no loophole-driven favoritism, no inflation tax destroying purchasing power. The math works out. The barriers are political, not economic. Washington does not want simplicity. Washington does not want transparency. Washington does not want restraint. Because complexity keeps citizens confused. Confusion keeps citizens compliant. And compliance keeps the tax machine running. Number 6, the bottom line. Americans aren't oppressed by taxes. They're oppressed by a government that wastes them. This is the thesis of this entire breakdown. Taxes are high because spending is out of control. Inflation exists because printing is out of control. Debt is exploding because discipline is gone. The American people are carrying a government that refuses to carry itself. And until this changes, nothing will change. If this breakdown opened your eyes, do one thing to help push this message through the algorithm. Like, subscribe, and please comment. For rapid updates you won't see on YouTube or here on my podcast, follow me over on TikTok, the Watchman 98. That's where I put out daily intel, no fluff, no spin. For long-form content, unfiltered geopolitical and mindset episodes, you can listen at the Watchman 98, my podcast over on Spotify. As always, stay aware, stay disciplined, and continue to stand watch.